Hello and welcome. My name is Katie Nosker, and I am the manager of the Supportive Housing Connection. Today, I will be going through each of the functional areas of the Supportive Housing Connection, and I'll be drawing a comparison between the way the programs have operated in the past and the way they will operate in the future. After I've walked through the comparisons, I'll lead you through some of the flowcharts that will explain each step of the process, and I'll talk through some of the documents that we use in the Supportive Housing Connection. The functional areas of the Supportive Housing Connection include housing search assistance, landlord recruitment, housing inspections, subsidy package processing, and we'll get into exactly what a subsidy package is in a little bit, rental subsidy administration, tenant-landlord inquiry resolutions, which is kind of a fancy way of saying tenant-landlord mediation. And all of the above services are included for HMFA-financed DDD and DMHAS projects. Now, in terms of the housing search, currently, individuals themselves and or with their advocate, provider, or guardian can locate housing. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, individuals may choose a DDD licensed housing setting that they are referred to by DDD and based on DDD policy. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. One thing that is different now is that the Supportive Housing Connection can provide tools to locate housing and assist with landlord recruitment. I also want to clarify that someone coming out of a developmental center can, with their guardian, select a licensed group home as recommended by their provider. So, tenants can find housing in a number of ways, with the assistance of their provider or advocate, on their own, or through a referral by DDD to a licensed housing setting. And the SHC can connect tenants with tools and resources to locate housing. One point of clarification is that the SHC will not actually take tenants out to find units. And referrals for DDD licensed settings will continue to be made through community services and through the Olmstead program. The New Jersey Housing Resource Center, or NJHRC, is an NJHMFA service and tool to find housing. It is a searchable, interactive, online database of affordable and accessible units located throughout the state of New Jersey. This resource has 30 general and advanced search fields, many of which relate to accessibility features. It also has a Spanish and English toll-free call center number. This database is managed by SocialServe, which is a nonprofit that provides housing locator tools to states and localities throughout the country. SocialServe, through the njhrc.gov website, provides online and call center-based housing locator services in an updated and maintained database that holds current information on more than 140,000 rental units and affordable homes for across New Jersey, as well as contact information for 5,300 property providers. HMFA contracted with SocialServe after Superstorm Sandy to provide outreach specifically for short-term rental units. SocialServe did such a great job with their outreach efforts that FEMA eventually decided to use SocialServe's list of rental units as theirs was better maintained. We look forward to working with SocialServe on this project. Now, in terms of landlord recruitment, to enhance the number of affordable housing opportunities, the SHC is working with SocialServe to recruit new landlords to participate in this program. The SHC is providing training and assistance to both new and existing landlords to help them through this process. and the SHC will work with HMFA-financed DDD and DMHAS projects to provide technical assistance where applicable. Social Serve will be sending out email blasts, making phone calls, and creating flyers to encourage current and prospective landlords to post units that are at or below the fair market rent, or FMR, on the New Jersey Housing Resource Center. Now, we also have a document that's called the Supportive Housing Connection, or SHC Addendum to the HAP contract. Now, the HAP contract, Housing Assistance Payment Contract, is what Section 8 uses, and we use that along with the addendum. And this is an agreement between the SHC and the landlord regarding the DHS subsidy and the SHC's policies and procedures. This is a document that must be signed before a tenant leases a unit. In terms of housing inspections, currently for DDD licensed settings, there is a pre-inspection done by DDD staff. This remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, for DHS licensed settings, there is an inspection done by DHS Office of Licensing. This remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. And lastly, currently, for DMHAS, provider agencies perform housing inspections. Here's where we do have a difference under the SHC. Under the SHC, inspections will be completed by trained SHC and affiliated staff for all DDD and DMHAS unlicensed units. The housing inspections that we perform will be based on HUD housing quality standards. These standards are intended to ensure that individuals live in safe, decent, and affordable housing. This also applies to HMFA-financed DDD and DMHAS projects. These inspections are conducted prior to move-in, annually, and on an as-needed basis. HUD housing quality standards requires that we check a number of items related to the tenant's living situation. They include living rooms, bathrooms, kitchens, other rooms, the building exterior plumbing and heating, as well as for any health and safety issues. Now, in terms of subsidy package processing, currently for DMHAS, subsidy packages are sent to DMHAS staff for processing. Also currently, for DDD, housing costs are bundled with service costs in the budget and contract. Moving forward under the SHC, all subsidy packages for both DDD and DMHAS will be sent to the Supportive Housing Connection for processing. Now, you may be wondering what goes into a subsidy package. Well, it includes items from both the tenant and the landlord. From the landlord, it includes the signed SHC addendum to the HAP, as well as the actual HAP, direct deposit information, and the W-9. From the tenant, we require the most current income documents, a signed lease, the rental subsidy calculation worksheet, and the SHC is using the same rental subsidy calculation methodology as currently used by DMHAS, and the signed tenant's rental subsidy agreement. Income will be calculated according to DHS standards initially, annually, as income changes, and every 6 months for consumers who have no income. The SHC will notify both the tenant and the landlord of the amount to be paid by the tenant and the subsidy amount that will be paid by the Supportive Housing Connection. We want everybody to be on the same page about the subsidies and tenants' contributions that will be paid. In terms of the subsidy payments, currently, rental subsidies or housing costs are paid to provider agencies who use those funds to pay landlords. Moving forward under the SHC, the Supportive Housing Connection will make rental subsidy payments directly to the landlord. Also currently, in unlicensed settings, tenants pay their portion directly to the landlord. that remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. And lastly, currently, in licensed settings, tenants pay their contribution to care. Under the Supportive Housing Connection, tenants will pay their rental portion directly to the landlord. To clarify, the Supportive Housing Connection will make the rental subsidy payment on behalf of DHS each month via direct deposit into the landlord's account. DHS will also continue making payments for a number of items. These items include furniture stipend funds, fire suppression funds, and this is for specifically HMFA financed projects, security deposits, as well as utility startup funds. Stakeholders will be notified as these processes move over to the Supportive Housing Connection for administration. In terms of tenant-landlord inquiry resolution or tenant-landlord mediation, currently landlords and individuals, with the assistance of provider agencies, work together to resolve issues. That remains the same under the Supportive Housing Connection. Also currently, landlords and individuals sometimes contact DHS for assistance. Moving forward, landlords and individuals may contact the SHC if issues cannot be resolved. Service providers will continue to assist and advocate for their service recipients, and the SHC will be a centralized location to receive inquiries from both tenants and landlords. In some instances, these issues will be elevated to DHS or other parties. So you may be wondering, when exactly should you contact the SHC? And the answer is that it's after the landlord, tenant, and provider agency have attempted to resolve the housing-related issues among themselves first. So we have a few different types of situations that the SHC might help resolve. These housing-related issues include issues related to the tenant and landlord relationship, violations of HUD housing quality standards that are not remediated in a timely manner. For instance, the hot water doesn't work, the heat doesn't work, or a window is broken, or questions or concerns involving SHC policies and practices. In terms of the timeline, the program was launched in February of 2015 and ramps up as DHS transfers existing and new subsidies to the Supportive Housing Connection. Existing participants will be notified via mail, email, or phone and assisted through this transition. Okay, now I would like to take some time to go through a few different flow charts that we have. I first want to talk through the overview process flow to give you a general sense of how this program works. We'll then go through the tenant's process flow chart, which essentially explains the process from the tenant's point of view. And lastly, we'll go through the same process, but from the landlord's point of view. So what is it that they see, experience, or how does it flow? What documents do they need to provide to us when? So let's get right to it. Okay, so we're starting with the overall flow chart. So the process starts, everything begins when the Department of Human Services approves a tenant for subsidy. I want to be very clear here that the Supportive Housing Connection does not make any decisions about who does or does not receive a subsidy. DHS then sends the tenant's information over to the Supportive Housing Connection. The SHC then issues a welcome letter to the tenant. Now, there are two possible things that can happen next. If the tenant has already identified a unit where they'd like to live, that's great, that's fine. We then move forward to inspecting the unit. If the tenant has not yet located a unit, they then find a unit with help from the provider and the Supportive Housing Connection. Either way, once the tenant has located a unit where they would like to live, the SHC performs the unit inspection. Now again, there are a couple of different potential outcomes here. If there is a deficiency or kind of a fail item, the supportive housing connection would work with the landlord to correct the deficiency if possible. Once we have a unit that passes, the tenant and landlord would send the SHC all the required documents. The SHC would then process the subsidy package. The SHC would then notify the landlord and the tenant of the contribution by tenant and subsidy. The SHC would then begin making the rental payment. The tenant could then move into the unit. Next, the SHC would provide the rental subsidy until the end of the lease term. Now, 3 months prior to the lease expiration, the supportive housing connection will contact both the landlord and the tenant to begin the recertification process and to learn the tenant's status. This is where the tenant has a choice to make. And that choice is whether or not to continue with the program, whether or not to continue with the unit. So one possible outcome is that the tenant can say, you know what, I love the program, love the unit, we're going to be re-signing a lease. In that case, that's fine. The whole process loops back to the SHC performing the unit inspection. If there are any deficiencies, we work with the landlord to correct them. We then need to collect the same documents the next year. We process the subsidy package, notify everyone of the contributions by tenant and subsidy, etc. Another potential outcome is that the tenant can say, you know what, I love the program, but I don't really love this unit. Or maybe they want to move to be closer to family or a new job or whatever the case may be. That's fine too. In that case, the whole process loops back to the tenant finding a unit with help from the provider and the supportive housing connection. We go through, perform the unit inspection, correct any deficiencies if possible, and review the documents. The final potential outcome is that the tenant can say, you know what, they can refuse to participate in the program. They can say, you know what, I'm moving out of state, my family's in Florida or California or wherever it is. And in that case, at the end of the lease term, they would exit the program and the lease would be terminated. So that concludes the overall process flowchart. Next, I'd like to go through the tenant's flowchart. So this will look very similar to the overview that you just saw. The difference is that this talks about the whole process from the tenant's perspective. What is it? What documents do they receive when? What documents do they have to submit? We'll talk through it all. So again, the process starts when DHS approves a tenant for subsidy. The Department of Human Services then sends the tenant's information to the Supportive Housing Connection. The SHC prepares the welcome package for the tenant. And from the tenant's perspective, they then receive that welcome package from the SHC. There are two possible outcomes here. If they have already identified a unit, the Supportive Housing Connection moves right to performing the unit inspection. If they don't have a unit yet, they would then find a unit with the providers and Supportive Housing Connection's assistance. They then notify the SHC of the unit chosen. And we'll go through this form in a minute, but it's called the Unit Identification Form. And it's a really key form that when we receive it, it means that we then have 5 business days to actually conduct that inspection. So that's a very key part of the process. Either way, once the tenant has identified a unit, the Supportive Housing Connection performs the inspection. There is a potential that the unit could fail the inspection, and in that case, the landlord corrects the deficiency if possible. If it's something that can't be corrected, or the landlord goes through, they get 3 tries to make that correction. We go out once. If it's not corrected, if it doesn't pass right then, they have 14 days to make any corrections. We go out again. If it fails again, they then have 5 days to make any corrections. We come out one more time. If it fails that 3rd time, we advise the tenant to find a new unit. But once we do have a unit that passes, a tenant sends the following documents to the Supportive Housing Connection. That includes the signed tenant's rental subsidy agreement, all the income documentation, and the signed lease. The Supportive Housing Connection then processes this subsidy package. The tenant would then be notified by the SHC of the subsidy amount as well as the tenant's contribution. The tenant and SHC would then make their contributions towards the rent and the security deposit. The tenant moves into the unit. The tenant and SHC pay their contributions through the end of the lease term. Now, 90 days prior to the tenant's lease expiration, they will receive a letter from the Supportive Housing Connection to know the status and begin the recertification process. This is where the tenant has a bit of a choice, and they need to let us know their intent. So they may say, you know what, I love the program, love the unit, and in that case, the whole process loops back to the Supportive Housing Connection performing the unit inspection. If it doesn't pass the first time, we work with the landlord to correct deficiencies if possible. Assuming it passes, we loop back to collecting the necessary documents, processing the subsidy package, notifying everyone of the subsidy amount and tenant's contribution, and making the rental payments. The tenant can also say, you know, this is about 3 months out from when their lease will be up. They can also say, you know what, I love the program, but I really want to move at this time. That's fine too. In that case, the process loops back to the tenant finding a unit with the providers and Supportive Housing Connection's assistance. Again, they have to notify us of the unit they've chosen. We perform the inspection, collect the documents, etc. Lastly, the tenant has one other potential choice that he or she can make, and that is that they can decide not to continue with the program. You know, again, if they're moving out of state or whatever the case may be, then the lease and subsidy would not be renewed. So that concludes the tenant's perspective of the Supportive Housing Connection process. The last document last flow chart that I want to go through here is the process from the landlord's perspective, because this one does look a little bit different. You'll notice the difference right off the bat when it's a very different start point. The process for the landlord starts when the tenant contacts the landlord to see a unit. So this is actually pretty critical because it means that the Supportive Housing Connection does not pre-approve landlords to list their units or, you know, pre-approve them to participate in this program. Tenants can choose from a number of different units, and once the tenant decides on one that they would like to live in, that's when the process begins. So once the tenant has contacted the landlord to see the unit, the landlord reviews their application. There is a potential that the landlord could say no, maybe that unit has already been rented out or something like that. Assuming the landlord agrees and would like to continue this relationship, they then need to send the following documents to the Supportive Housing Connection. That includes their payment information and landlord agreement, which is another name for our HAP contract and SHC Addendum. They also need to send the lease information to the tenant. Obviously, the tenant needs to know what the rent will be, what exactly the unit address is, things like that. The Supportive Housing Connection then reviews the documents that are sent in. And the reason we have a potential for a fail here is because if the landlord refuses to sign the HAP agreement and SHC Addendum, we will not be able to move forward with this relationship. But assuming the landlord agrees to sign the documents, we move forward, everything passes. Supportive Housing Connection goes out and performs an inspection of the unit. If the unit does not pass, we work with the landlord to correct the deficiency if possible. Once the unit passes the inspection, the landlord then receives a letter from the Supportive Housing Connection which states that the unit passed and notifies them of the tenant and subsidy contribution. The landlord would then receive the first month's rent as well as the security deposit. The tenant would move into the unit. The landlord would receive the rental subsidy as well as the tenant's contribution each month for the lease term. and then 90 days prior to the end of the lease term, the Supportive Housing Connection would inquire about the status and begin the recertification process. This is where there is a lease renewal decision. If the landlord and tenant decide not to continue with this relationship, obviously the subsidy would not continue. Assuming they want to continue this relationship, that's fine. The process then loops back to collecting the documents, making sure everything's signed, performing the unit inspection, and then paying the rental contributions ongoing. So that concludes the landlord's view of the Supportive Housing Connection process. So let me jump back here a little bit to the PowerPoint. So I did want to go through a few of the documents that we use in the Supportive Housing Connection so that people are familiar with them when they receive them. So the first document is the Unit Identification Form. So as I've mentioned before, this is a really critical document. This is the document that we need to receive at Supportive Housing Connection to tell us what unit a tenant would like to see. It includes information about the tenant's name, where they're moving exactly, what the monthly rent will be. We have some questions in there about, whether utilities are included, how many bedrooms are in there. And we ask for landlord contact information as well as provider contact information. We have found in our experience so far that we frequently don't get these last two pieces of information. They're actually really critical because, first of all, we need the landlord's contact information in order to actually schedule the inspection. If we don't have that correct contact information, we obviously can't go out, find the unit and get in there to determine if it is safe and suitable for occupancy. We also really do want the provider's contact information, in part because, you may be saying like, well, we're in contact with you all the time, we already know this information. This information actually passes through a couple of different hands, so it's really helpful to make sure, and certainly we want to be able to notify provider organizations of the results, so this, filling out this information helps us serve you better. So that's the Unit Identification Form. Next is the Tenant's Information Form. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit here. So this has some information about the tenant, where they're living. Primary contact would be any other contact, a guardian, something like that, that the tenant would like us to contact on their behalf. The provider or support coordinator name and contact information. We ask the tenant to tell us who else is living in the unit so we can get all of that information in there. We ask them to verify the landlord whose property they're living with. Here's where we ask for the income documentation. And we do ask the tenant to sign this document. The reason we ask them to sign it is because this form allows us, by their signature, allows us to contact these entities on their behalf. And this is a document that would be submitted before a tenant moves into a unit and at annual recertification. Okay. Next are two items that are definitely interrelated. The first is the HAP contract, or Housing Assistance Payments Contract. This is exactly the same thing that Section 8 uses. So we ask that a landlord fill this out once and then sign the SHC Addendum for each tenant. So the HAP contract, as I said, is really the exact same thing that HUD uses and has approved. So it has some information in here. The next item that we have is the Supportive Housing Connection, or SHC Addendum, to the HAP contract. And this is where we ask for tenant-specific information. This information is at the back. That's why we ask for it by tenant. We ask the landlord to clarify who they think is living in the unit, the dates of the lease term, things like that, number of bedrooms in the unit. A critical piece here is that we ask for payment information because all rental assistance payments are made via direct deposit. So this is where they tell us how we should pay them for this particular tenant. And we ask to learn about the utilities, what's being paid by the tenant, what they are paying for as the owner, and information about the security deposit. We then need this document signed as well. So that concludes the discussion of the various key documents that we have here. And the very last thing that we have is contact information for the Supportive Housing Connection. You can reach us at shc@njhmfa.gov or 1-844-216-6988. Or you can visit our website to learn more information about the program at www.njshc.gov. And you can also sign up to receive emails regarding the Supportive Housing Connection. Thank you very much for participating.